The Femme Fatale squad captured Nick Barnes in the nightclub and demanded everything he knew. The rise of Nick Barnes and the underworld's most dangerous women. The neon lights of Manhattan's underground nightclub scene cast long shadows across the faces of those who inhabited its darkest corners. It was here, in the pulsating heart of the city's criminal underworld, that Nick Barnes had built his reputation as one of the most ruthless and cunning drug lords of the 1970s. But what few people knew was that his downfall would not come at the hands of federal agents or rival male dealers. It would come from an unexpected quarter, a collective of intelligent, dangerous women who had grown tired of being underestimated and exploited by the men who controlled the drug trade. Nick Barnes was born in Harlem in 1947, and by the time he reached his 20s, he had already established himself as a formidable presence in the city's drug distribution networks. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Barnes possessed a sharp intellect and a strategic mind that allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime with remarkable success. He had connections to major suppliers, a loyal network of street-level dealers, and most importantly, he had the respect and fear of those around him. By the early 1970s, Nick Barnes was earning millions of dollars annually, and his influence extended across multiple boroughs of New York City. Barnes's operation was built on a foundation of violence, intimidation, and calculated business decisions. He was known for his willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his interests, and his reputation for brutality preceded him wherever he went. But beneath this veneer of toughness, Barnes was also a man who enjoyed the finer things in life. He frequented exclusive nightclubs, surrounded himself with beautiful women, and lived a lifestyle that was the envy of many in the criminal underworld. He believed himself to be invincible, untouchable, and beyond the reach of those who might challenge his authority. What Nick Barnes failed to recognize was that his arrogance and his treatment of women as disposable commodities had created a dangerous enemy. Throughout his years of criminal activity, Barnes had used and discarded numerous women, some as romantic partners, others as unwitting accomplices in his schemes. He had promised them money, protection, and a better life, only to abandon them when they were no longer useful. He had involved them in his criminal enterprises without their full knowledge or consent, exposing them to legal jeopardy and physical danger. And most critically, he had underestimated their intelligence, their resilience, and their capacity for revenge. Among the women who had been wronged by Nick Barnes was a group of exceptionally talented and dangerous individuals who had begun to organize in secret. These women came from diverse backgrounds. Some were former girlfriends, others were sisters or relatives of people Barnes had harmed, and still others were women who had been drawn into his criminal network and exploited for their connections and their willingness to take risks. What united them was a shared determination to bring Nick Barnes to justice and to expose the extent of his criminal empire. They called themselves the Femme Fatale Squad, and they were about to change the course of Nick Barnes's life forever. The Femme Fatale Squad was led by a woman named Veronica, a former art student who had become involved with Nick Barnes in the late 1960s. Veronica had been intelligent, ambitious, and beautiful, everything that Barnes claimed to value in a woman. But when she had become pregnant with his child, Barnes had pressured her to have an abortion, claiming that a child would complicate his business operations. When she refused, he had cut off all contact with her and had begun spreading rumors about her throughout the criminal underworld, effectively destroying her reputation and her ability to earn a living. Veronica had spent years rebuilding her life, and in doing so, she had developed a network of connections and a deep understanding of how Barnes's criminal enterprise functioned. Alongside Veronica were 4 other women, each of whom brought unique skills and perspectives to the Femme Fatale Squad. There was Diamond, a former exotic dancer who had worked in several of the nightclubs where Barnes conducted his business and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of his associates and his operations. There was Sophia, a woman with a background in accounting and finance who had been forced to launder money for Barnes and who understood the intricacies of his financial networks. There was Maya, a former journalist who had been investigating organized crime and who had developed sophisticated research and investigative skills. And there was Jade, a woman with connections to law enforcement who had been using her position to gather intelligence on Barnes's activities. Together, these 5 women had spent months planning their operation. They had gathered evidence of Barnes's criminal activities, documented his connections to major suppliers and distributors, and identified the locations where he conducted his most important business. They had also developed a detailed understanding of Barnes's personality, his habits, and his vulnerabilities. They knew that he was vain, that he was overconfident, and that he had a weakness for beautiful women and exclusive nightclubs. And they had decided to use all of this information to orchestrate his capture and to extract from him the secrets that would bring down his entire criminal empire. If you're captivated by stories of cunning, revenge, and the untold narratives of women who challenge the criminal underworld, subscribe to our channel now. Join thousands of viewers who are discovering the hidden histories of those who dared to fight back against corruption and exploitation. Hit that subscribe button and become part of our community. The nightclub chosen for the operation was called Obsidian, one of the most exclusive and expensive establishments in Manhattan. It was located in a converted warehouse in the Lower East Side, and it catered to a clientele of wealthy criminals, corrupt politicians, and celebrities who valued discretion and luxury. Nick Barnes was a regular at Obsidian, and he typically spent his Friday and Saturday nights there, surrounded by his associates and his current romantic interests. The club's owner, a man named Victor, had been persuaded by the Femme Fatale squad to cooperate with their plan. Victor had his own reasons for wanting to see Nick Barnes brought down. Barnes had been using the club as a front for money laundering and had been threatening to take over Victor's business entirely. The plan was intricate and required precise timing and coordination. The Femme Fatale squad had arranged for Veronica to approach Nick Barnes at the club, presenting herself as a woman from his past who had reinvented herself and who was now working as a high-end consultant for wealthy clients. Veronica had undergone a complete transformation: new hair, new wardrobe, new identity, and she was confident that Barnes would not immediately recognize her. Her role was to engage Barnes in conversation, to flatter his ego, and to lure him to a private area of the club where the rest of the squad could intercept him. Diamond, meanwhile, had been hired by the club as a special performer for the evening. She would be dancing in the main performance area, and her presence would serve as a distraction, drawing attention away from the private areas of the club where the operation would take place. Sophia had arranged for the club's security system to be temporarily disabled, ensuring that there would be no video recording of what was about to happen. Maya had positioned herself in the club's administrative offices, where she could monitor communications and ensure that no one would be able to call for help. And Jade had arranged for several of her contacts in law enforcement to be positioned outside the club, ready to move in if the situation escalated beyond the squad's control. On the night of the operation, Nick Barnes arrived at Obsidian around midnight, accompanied by 2 of his bodyguards. He was in a good mood, confident and relaxed, having just completed a major drug transaction that had netted him several $100,000. He made his way to his usual table, ordered an expensive bottle of champagne, and settled in to enjoy the evening. He was immediately drawn to the performance of Diamond, whose dancing was both sensual and hypnotic. But his attention was soon diverted when Veronica approached his table, introducing herself with a sultry smile and a carefully rehearsed story about being a wealthy businesswoman who had heard about his reputation and who was interested in getting to know him better. Nick Barnes, flattered by the attention and intoxicated by the combination of alcohol and cocaine that he had consumed earlier in the evening, was easily seduced by Veronica's charm and beauty. He invited her to sit at his table, and they engaged in conversation that was carefully designed to appeal to his vanity and his ego. Veronica spoke about his reputation, his power, and his success, all the while subtly steering the conversation toward more private and intimate topics. She suggested that they move to one of the club's private VIP rooms, where they could talk more freely and where the music would not be so loud. Nick Barnes, eager to impress this beautiful woman and confident in his ability to control any situation, agreed without hesitation. As they made their way through the club toward the private VIP area, Veronica signaled to the rest of the squad. The bodyguards, who had been stationed at the main table, were suddenly distracted by a commotion that had been orchestrated by members of the squad. One of the women had deliberately spilled a drink on one of the bodyguards, creating a scene that required their attention. By the time they realized what was happening, Nick Barnes had already been escorted into the private VIP room by Veronica, and the door had been locked behind them. Inside the VIP room, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Veronica's demeanor shifted from seductive to cold and businesslike. She revealed her true identity to Nick Barnes, and his face went pale as he realized who she was and what was about to happen. Before he could react, the other members of the Femme Fatale squad entered the room through a hidden door that had been specially prepared for this purpose. Nick Barnes found himself surrounded by 5 women, all of whom were armed and all of whom were looking at him with expressions of cold determination. The audacity and intelligence of the Femme Fatale squad's operation is truly remarkable. If you're impressed by their strategic planning and their courage in confronting one of the city's most dangerous criminals, please like this video. Your support helps us continue to bring you these compelling stories of justice and retribution. Nick Barnes's initial reaction was one of shock and disbelief. He had been caught completely off guard, and for the first time in years, he found himself in a situation where he did not have the upper hand. He attempted to bluster and threaten, telling the women that they had made a terrible mistake and that they would pay dearly for their actions. But his threats fell on deaf ears. The Femme Fatale squad had prepared extensively for this moment, and they were not intimidated by his posturing. Veronica took the lead in the interrogation, and she began by explaining to Nick Barnes exactly why he had been captured. She detailed the ways in which he had exploited and harmed women throughout his criminal career. She spoke about the promises he had made and broken, the lives he had disrupted, and the trauma he had caused. She told him about the child he had forced her to abort, about the women he had used as unwitting accomplices in his crimes, and about the families he had destroyed through his drug distribution operations. As she spoke, Nick Barnes's face grew darker, and he began to realize the full extent of the danger he was in. The interrogation that followed was methodical and relentless. The women had prepared detailed questions about every aspect of Nick Barnes's criminal enterprise. They wanted to know about his suppliers, his distribution networks, his financial arrangements, and his connections to other criminals and corrupt officials. They wanted to know about the locations of his stash houses, the identities of his most trusted associates, and the details of his money laundering operations. And most importantly, they wanted to know about the crimes he had committed and the people he had harmed. Nick Barnes initially refused to cooperate, maintaining that he would not betray his associates or provide information that could be used against him. But the women had anticipated this response, and they had prepared a series of leverage points that they were willing to use. They had gathered evidence of his crimes, including photographs, financial records, and testimony from witnesses. They had documented his connections to murders, assaults, and drug trafficking operations. And they had made it clear that if he did not cooperate, they would turn all of this evidence over to law enforcement, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. As the interrogation continued, Nick Barnes began to understand that he was facing a choice between 2 equally unpleasant outcomes. On one hand, he could refuse to cooperate and face the consequences of having all of his crimes exposed to law enforcement. On the other hand, he could provide the information that the Femme Fatale squad was demanding and hope that they would honor their promise to allow him to escape. It was a devil's bargain, but it was the only option available to him. Over the course of several hours, Nick Barnes gradually began to reveal the secrets of his criminal empire. He provided detailed information about his suppliers in Southeast Asia and South America, naming specific individuals and describing the routes through which drugs were smuggled into the United States. He revealed the locations of his stash houses, where millions of dollars in cash and drugs were stored. He identified his most trusted associates and described their roles in his organization. He detailed his financial arrangements, including the banks and businesses through which he laundered his money. And he provided information about the corrupt officials and law enforcement officers who had been protecting his operations in exchange for bribes and a share of the profits. The women recorded everything, capturing Nick Barnes's confessions on audio and video. They took detailed notes, cross-referencing his statements with the evidence they had already gathered. They asked follow-up questions, probing for inconsistencies and demanding clarification on points that were unclear. By the time the interrogation was complete, they had accumulated a comprehensive record of Nick Barnes's criminal activities, a record that would be sufficient to bring down not only Barnes himself, but also many of the other criminals and corrupt officials who had been part of his network. As the night wore on, Nick Barnes became increasingly emotional. He began to express regret for his actions, to acknowledge the harm he had caused, and to beg for mercy. He spoke about his childhood, about the poverty and violence he had experienced, and about how these experiences had shaped his choices. He talked about the women he had loved and lost, about the children he had fathered and abandoned, and about the emptiness that had characterized his life despite all of his wealth and power. For the first time, it seemed, Nick Barnes was confronting the full moral weight of his actions. What do you think about the Femme Fatale squad's methods of justice? Do you believe they were justified in capturing and interrogating Nick Barnes, or do you think they should have gone directly to law enforcement? Share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below. We're interested in hearing your analysis of this complex moral situation. As dawn broke over Manhattan, the Femme Fatale squad made the decision to release Nick Barnes. They had obtained all of the information they needed, and they had no desire to hold him captive any longer. They warned him that if he attempted to flee the city or to harm any of them, they would immediately turn over all of the evidence they had gathered to law enforcement. They also made it clear that they would be monitoring his activities closely and that any attempt to retaliate against them would result in immediate exposure. Nick Barnes, broken and humiliated, agreed to their terms. He was released from the VIP room and allowed to leave the club through a back exit. He made his way home in a daze, struggling to comprehend what had happened and what it meant for his future. He knew that his empire was finished, that his secrets had been exposed, and that his days of freedom were numbered. True to their word, the Femme Fatale squad did not immediately turn over the evidence to law enforcement. Instead, they took a more strategic approach. They began to leak information about Nick Barnes's criminal activities to journalists and investigative reporters. They provided evidence to federal agents who were investigating organized crime in New York. They contacted the families of people who had been harmed by Barnes's drug distribution operations, offering them the opportunity to pursue civil litigation against him. And they ensured that the information about his corruption of law enforcement officials reached the appropriate oversight bodies. The exposure of Nick Barnes's criminal empire was swift and devastating. Within weeks, federal agents had launched a major investigation into his activities. They executed search warrants on his properties, seizing millions of dollars in cash, drugs, and weapons. They arrested dozens of his associates, using the information provided by the Femme Fatale squad to build cases against them. And they began to unravel the network of corruption that had allowed Barnes to operate with impunity for so many years. Nick Barnes himself was arrested in early 1978, charged with multiple counts of drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his conviction seemed inevitable. But Barnes, recognizing that he was facing a lengthy prison sentence, made a decision that would have profound consequences for the criminal underworld of New York City. He agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors, providing testimony against his associates and against the corrupt law enforcement officials who had been protecting his operations. Barnes's cooperation led to the prosecution and conviction of numerous criminals and corrupt officials. It exposed the extent of organized crime's infiltration of law enforcement agencies and government institutions. And it demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful criminal enterprises when their secrets are exposed and their operations are disrupted. Nick Barnes was sentenced to life in prison, but his sentence was later reduced in recognition of his cooperation with the authorities. The Femme Fatale squad, meanwhile, had achieved their objective. They had brought down one of the most powerful drug lords in New York City, and they had done so through intelligence, courage, and determination. They had demonstrated that women could be just as effective as men in the criminal underworld, and that they could use their intelligence and their understanding of human nature to accomplish what brute force alone could not achieve. Their operation had been a masterclass in strategic planning and psychological manipulation. However, the squad's success came with a cost. Several of the women involved in the operation faced legal jeopardy themselves. Veronica was charged with kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, though the charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence and the cooperation of witnesses. Diamond faced similar charges, as did the other members of the squad. But the publicity surrounding their operation had generated significant public sympathy for their cause, and many people viewed them as heroes rather than criminals. The story of the Femme Fatale squad's capture of Nick Barnes became legendary in the criminal underworld and in the broader culture of New York City. It was whispered about in bars and nightclubs, told and retold with embellishments and variations. It inspired other women who had been victimized by criminals to organize and to seek their own forms of justice. And it challenged the prevailing narrative about crime and punishment in America, suggesting that justice could be achieved through means other than the formal legal system. The story of the Femme Fatale squad is a testament to the power of women to challenge the criminal establishment and to pursue justice on their own terms. If you haven't already subscribed to our channel, now is the perfect time to do so. We bring you stories of courage, intelligence, and determination that challenge conventional narratives about crime and justice. Subscribe today and never miss an update. Years after the events of that fateful night in the Obsidian nightclub, the members of the Femme Fatale squad had moved on with their lives. Veronica had returned to her studies and had become a successful artist, using her experiences to create powerful works that explored themes of justice, revenge, and redemption. Diamond had left the world of exotic dancing and had become a counselor for women who had been victimized by criminals and abusers. Sophia had established herself as a financial consultant, helping law enforcement agencies to understand and combat money laundering operations. Maya had continued her work as a journalist, writing extensively about organized crime and corruption. And Jade had risen through the ranks of law enforcement, eventually becoming a detective specializing in organized crime investigations. The legacy of the Femme Fatale squad extended far beyond the capture of Nick Barnes. Their operation had demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful criminal enterprises to intelligent and determined opposition. It had shown that women could be effective agents of justice and that they could use their intelligence, their understanding of human nature, and their willingness to take risks to accomplish what seemed impossible. And it had challenged the prevailing assumptions about gender, power, and the criminal underworld. In the years following the operation, numerous books and documentaries were produced about the Femme Fatale squad. Their story was adapted into films and television series, though many of these adaptations took significant liberties with the facts in order to make the narrative more dramatic and entertaining. The women themselves became reluctant celebrities, sought out for interviews and speaking engagements. Some of them embraced this attention, using their platform to advocate for victims of crime and to challenge the systems that had allowed criminals like Nick Barnes to operate with impunity. Others preferred to maintain their privacy, viewing their role in bringing down Barnes as a chapter of their lives that they preferred to leave behind. The impact of the Femme Fatale squad's operation on the criminal underworld of New York City was significant and lasting. The dismantling of Nick Barnes's empire created a power vacuum that was filled by other criminals, but it also demonstrated that even the most powerful drug lords were vulnerable to exposure and prosecution. Law enforcement agencies became more aggressive in their investigations of organized crime, and they began to pay greater attention to the role that women could play in gathering intelligence and building cases against criminals. The operation also had broader cultural implications. It challenged the prevailing narrative about women's roles in society and suggested that women could be just as capable as men of engaging in complex, dangerous, and morally ambiguous activities. It raised questions about the nature of justice and whether it could be pursued through means outside of the formal legal system. And it demonstrated the power of collective action and the importance of solidarity among those who had been victimized by the same perpetrator. Nick Barnes himself spent the remainder of his life in prison, eventually dying in 1998 at the age of 51. In his final years, he had become something of a philosopher, reflecting on his life and the choices he had made. He had written letters to some of the women he had harmed, expressing regret and asking for forgiveness. He had also written extensively about his experiences in the criminal underworld, providing insights into the psychology of criminals and the factors that had led him to pursue a life of crime. His writings, which were published posthumously, became required reading in criminology courses at several universities. The story of the Femme Fatale squad and their capture of Nick Barnes remains relevant today, more than 4 decades after the events took place. It speaks to the enduring power of collective action, the importance of justice for victims of crime, and the capacity of individuals to challenge systems of power and corruption. It demonstrates that justice can take many forms, and that sometimes the most effective agents of justice are those who operate outside of the formal legal system. And it reminds us that women have always played crucial roles in the struggle for justice. even when their contributions have been overlooked or underestimated by mainstream historical narratives. The Femme Fatale squad's operation was not without its critics. Some argued that their methods were illegal and unethical, that they had no right to take the law into their own hands, and that their actions set a dangerous precedent for vigilante justice. Others contended that their operation was justified given the failures of the formal legal system to protect women from exploitation and abuse. These debates continue to this day, reflecting deeper questions about the nature of justice, the role of law enforcement, and the rights and responsibilities of citizens in a democratic society. What remains undeniable is that the Femme Fatale squad's operation was a turning point in the history of organized crime in New York City. It exposed the vulnerability of even the most powerful criminals to intelligent and determined opposition. It demonstrated the power of women to challenge the criminal establishment, and it provided a model for how victims of crime could organize and pursue justice on their own terms. The legacy of the Femme Fatale squad continues to inspire those who seek to challenge corruption, exploitation, and injustice, reminding us that change is possible when individuals come together with a shared commitment to justice and a willingness to take risks in pursuit of that goal. The story of the Femme Fatale squad is one of the most compelling narratives of justice, courage, and female empowerment in the history of organized crime. If this story has resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of collective action to challenge injustice, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the methods used by the Femme Fatale squad? Do you believe they were justified in their actions? Subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more fascinating stories of those who dared to challenge the criminal establishment and pursue justice on their own terms. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to your engagement and your perspectives on this remarkable chapter of New York City's history.